Hello and welcome. Thank you, Fadhel Kaboub, for being here so much. My name is Al Lorenzo. I'm with the Newark Think Tank on Poverty, the think tanks, and Fairfield Think Tank on Poverty. We are an organization dedicated to making change at the local, statewide, and national level through direct action, which means making tangible change in people's lives, making people's quality of life better through community action. We do that through education, action, and partnership, and all of these things are making this interview happen. So I wanted to stop talking and let Fadhel introduce himself, your experience, what you do, and why you do it.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this opportunity, for all the good work you're doing with the Newark Think Tank on poverty. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I teach economics at Denison. I'm an associate professor of economics at Denison University here in Ohio, and I'm the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. My work and interest is really on trying to understand how we can introduce large-scale transformative public policies on health, on climate, on jobs without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country. It's really the economics behind large-scale public investments that will be impactful on people's quality of life. And how do we do it in terms of where does the money come from? How do we pay for it? And how do we do it without burdening working class or middle class families with, substantial taxes? How do we do it without bankrupting the country or causing massive inflation? That's in a kind of in a nutshell what I'm interested in terms of research and policy and community work.
That's awesome. There's a lot of pieces there, and they all function in this great economic machine that we operate in. So cool. I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that the think tank has done this summer to put this conversation in context. The think tank has, in the last 3 months, surveyed 1,000 homes in Newark in the south and east side, as well as 1,000 homes in the west side of Lancaster. There was an effort in the same vein in Athens, Ohio as well. And what we did was ask people about their different demographics, their experiences, what they think is important to see in their community as far as transportation. We asked about, affordable housing, all these different things. And we got those results back. We had 300 folks from each county approximately respond to the survey, which is a great return, a great result out of the numbers of homes that we surveyed. And the results were for Fairfield and Licking County and Newark and Lancaster that the number one most important issue was the same. And that number one most important issue was the increasing cost of food and groceries in these households. And we know that that's caused by inflation, and we can understand that there's a lot of confusion about what inflation is, why it's happening, and why it feels so out of control. Who do we talk to? Who do we quote blame for this, and why is it happening? So that's why Fadhel is here, to bring us the facts, to tell us the real story of what's happening in our economy and that's affecting our daily lives. So thank you again so much for being here, and I'm so excited to hear what you have to say. And thank you also for doing this important work. So could we start off maybe by saying, what is inflation?
Okay, very good question. So let's start with the basics. What is inflation, and how it's measured, and who measures it, and how it impacts all of us. So in the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a government agency within the Department of Labor, does these monthly surveys related to prices of food items and all the items that we consume. So what they do is they look at the average American family, not the richest, not the poorest, and they make a consumption basket of all the things that we typically buy: milk, butter, clothing, entertainment, transportation, housing, all the different items that the average family consumes. And they put a price tag on each one of those. I mean, they don't make up the price tags, they actually see what the prices are out there in grocery stores and so on. And they don't pick the most expensive item or the cheapest item. They collect kind of the average prices for milk, for butter, for tomatoes, for everything. And they track those prices over time. And once they construct that average consumer basket, they calculate the average prices of all those items. And they, of course, weigh them relative to how important that item is in the family's budget. So certain items are basic necessities and are critical to our consumption as average families. So they weigh them a little heavier than, say, a bubble gum in your consumer basket, which is not that important. So this way you have a meaningful weighted average for all of those items that we typically consume, again, as the average family. And then they calculate that average and they measure the difference or the change from month to month, year to year. And that change, if it's increasing, we call it inflation. If it's decreasing year to year, we call it deflation. So inflation is the increase in prices, average prices. Deflation is the decrease in average prices. And that's what we've been experiencing the last few months, is very high levels of inflation over time. But notice we haven't said anything about which items are really inflating more than others. We're talking about just the average that they report to us on a monthly basis. But most consumers will recognize that, and will notice that some prices are actually accelerating and going up on a much faster pace than other items. We don't usually pay attention to the items that remain affordable. We pay attention to the things that really cost substantially more. And these days, it's been obviously food prices and health, education, transportation, gas prices, rent prices. All of these things affect all of us because they're big ticket items in our budgets. So it's important to understand what we're talking about. And of course, when average prices increase, but your income and my income hasn't really changed very much month to month or year to year, we notice that we can't afford with our usual income to buy as much of certain items, or in some cases at all of certain basic necessities. And that's when it starts to really feel painful for our purchasing power, for our standard of living, where people start feeling like they have to cut corners in terms of food or transportation or paying certain bills. Especially we're going through a winter season now that's going to add additional costs in terms of heating bills, and energy prices have been through the roof and will probably continue in that direction in the future. So that's kind of the basic definition of what we're dealing with.
So interesting. It seems like there's a lot of complexity there. It's every item, every industry is affected at different rates of inflation, it sounds like. How does inflation, we're looking at inflation now, but how has inflation affected America, the global economy, in a historical context?
Very good question. So we'll stay focused with the US, but obviously the global situation does affect us, especially in the last couple of years. So if you look at inflation in the US before the pandemic, the last 10 years, the inflation rate has been roughly around 2%, even less than 2% after 2008, the financial crisis. So it's been very low, which doesn't actually mean that cost of living has been affordable for working class, for middle class. It just means that the average price level has been stable at around 1.5, 2% increase, annual increase. But if you actually look at the composition or the actual content of the different inflation components, we find 4 major inflation pressure points that have been persistent actually for the last at least 2 decades. And these 4 inflation areas are recognizable to most Americans. It's healthcare, it's energy and transportation, it's housing, and it's higher education. These are the major inflation pressure points that we've had in the US for the last at least 2 decades and continue to have right now. And then what happened is that during the COVID crisis, we've come under additional inflation pressure points related to the COVID pandemic. So it disrupted manufacturing and shipping, especially in China and different parts of the world, where shipping delays and these big traffic jams in the oceans when we open and shut down and open and shut down the economy and factories and have shortages of components and things like that. That led to another increase in prices globally, related to everything that we import, basically, and everything that requires a global coordination of production. So that became the second set of inflation pressure points that we've dealt with. And then last year, or earlier this year, when the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine started, it affected two major commodities. One is energy, oil and gas in particular, because Russia is a major exporter of energy. And the second item is food exports to the global economy, because the Ukraine and Russia combined are major exporters of wheat and corn and cooking oil and so many agricultural commodities, especially for countries in Africa and Asia and the rest of the world. They're major producers. So when you start seeing food prices going through the roof because of that conflict and fuel prices going through the roof, these two components are actually affecting almost everything else we produce, because you can't run any country without food, without fuel. Nobody can survive in this world without food, without fuel. So if the cost of food goes up and the cost of fuel goes up, the cost of shipping goes up, and the cost of producing electricity and manufacturing anything goes up, and the cost of labor starts to go up. We have actual food shortages in some parts of the world. In addition to the fact that the sanctions that we imposed on the Russian economy also happen to be sanctions that affected everything that the Russian economy exports, which includes minerals and raw materials that are big components of, say, China's manufacturing work, which ends up being shipped and consumed in the US, in our supermarkets and things like that. So the negative consequences of the sanctions eventually come back the other way around in terms of higher cost of manufacturing and delays in manufacturing and shortages in manufacturing. All of this leads to higher prices. So to be very clear about how we deal with the inflation that we're experiencing today, we have to be able to deal with the earlier inflation pressure points that we had in the US for the last 20 years. We have to be able to deal with the pandemic-related inflation pressure points, and we can talk about how we can do that. And then finally, we have to deal with the inflation pressure points that are coming out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So that's kind of the diagnosis of where the pressure points are coming from. And then we can talk about how we can address these things versus how some governments in Europe and the United States are thinking they're going to deal with these inflation pressure points.
That's awesome. When you were talking, I kind of had this vision in my mind, putting together that window in between like the 2008 crash and the 2012, kind of recovering from that, and then 2019 before the pandemic. There was a lot less pressure globally, right? And we weren't feeling inflation as much, but the pandemic, add the Russian conflict on top of that, there was a lot of constriction. And you're saying that's at least two of the pressure points here causing this?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's and you're absolutely right. It makes it even more complicated than the type of inflation we would have experienced without the pandemic and without the Russian conflict.
I would love to dive deeper into those and how how we can come out of those, like you were saying, just keep rolling.
Yeah. So I'll tell you what most countries and most economists, mainstream economists, would tell you needs to be done to address inflation. And we'll use our common sense thinking to determine whether that's going to address the inflation pressure points or not. So the common approach that most governments use, and when I say governments, it's the central bank. In the US, it's called the Federal Reserve Bank. So the Fed, short for Federal Reserve Bank, has been increasing interest rates, the rate at which the Fed would lend to the banking system. And of course, when the Fed raises its interest rate, all other interest rates in the economy will go up. And that's been happening. Mortgage rates, credit card rates, any lending rate that you and I, consumers, would use to borrow from a bank. And the thinking behind this is that when central banks, when the Fed raises interest rates, it makes it more expensive to borrow, and it starts to discourage spending, which means it starts to discourage consumer demand for certain products. And as consumer demand goes down, it allows for the existing production and supply to be large enough to satisfy all the consumers who are willing actually to pay for that stuff. And as a result, it will reduce the pressure on prices and it will lower prices. Now, they describe it in a very simplistic way, and they say, well, this will allow us to produce what they call a soft landing, to gently slow down the economy, slow down demand from consumers so that prices, stabilize and we get through this inflation cycle. The problem is there's never been an example of this so-called soft landing. What usually happens is that central banks raise interest rates until they slow down demand so much that they actually cause mass unemployment and a recession. So that will be a crash landing, not a soft landing. And that's really the big risk that we're facing here. And, you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to exactly what the Fed is saying. They're saying, we're going to persist with this policy of raising interest rates, and we're willing to go as far as causing a recession. They're very transparent about this, if we have to, in order to tame inflation. And that's the only policy tool that central bankers have. The only instrument they have is raising interest rates. So now you tell me with some basic common sense, when the central bank, when the Fed in the US and the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, when they raise interest rates, will that actually end the conflict in the Ukraine and reduce that inflation pressure point? I don't think so. When the central bank raises interest rates in Europe and the US and Japan and the UK, will that unclog the global supply chains coming out of Asia and disruptions related to the COVID pandemic, opening and shutting down factories, that the massive traffic jams we have in the oceans, will that be affected, and will that resolve that inflation pressure point? Common sense tells us no, it will not. If anything, it may actually make it worse, because you're raising the cost of doing business on manufacturers, you're raising the cost of doing business on shipping companies and so on. So it may actually make things worse. And then finally, going back to our earlier inflation pressure points in the US, pre-pandemic, pre the Russian conflict, we talked about healthcare, education, energy and transportation, and housing. Will raising the interest rate in the US resolve our housing shortage, right? Will raising the interest rate reduce the abusive market power of slumlords and real estate speculators? Absolutely not. Will raising the interest rate resolve our, broken healthcare system? Absolutely not. If anything, it may make it worse, actually, over time. So the policy tool, the main policy tool that most economists tell you is what needs to be done, is actually going to be very dangerous and destructive. It may actually fuel inflation rather than reduce inflation. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we've been having some serious conversations from alternative economic thinking, from different community groups pushing back against this traditional approach of fighting inflation by raising interest rates. And we've shifted the terms of the debate towards what we're talking about right here, which is, let's use common sense. Now that we've identified the inflation pressure points, let's think about why those inflation pressure points are there in the first place, and how can we tackle the roots of those inflation pressure points. So two things we identify when we look at these inflation pressure points, especially the pre-COVID inflation pressure points in the US. And it's two areas. One is that we have a lack of productive capacity in these key areas, lack of housing, especially affordable housing. But number two, we have abusive market power. In other words, we have market concentration with key players who can raise prices simply because they can, because they have too much market power. So what we need to do is two things. Number one, increase the productive capacity so that we democratize access to those resources, whether it's housing, education, healthcare, public transportation. So we end up hiring more people, building better infrastructure. So we create actually more jobs and we democratize access to those resources. And at the same time, we tax and regulate that abusive market power out of existence, which means update our antitrust laws and go after speculators, go after monopoly power, go after abusive corporate power that is currently able to raise prices simply because they're taking advantage of the crisis. And don't take my word for it. Go listen to major corporations when they talk to their shareholders on a regular basis in these public conference calls. They're actually saying it explicitly. They're saying we are taking advantage of this panic moment where everybody's talking about inflation and we're raising our prices, not just to make up for the additional cost of doing business. Now we understand energy cost is higher, labor cost might be a little bit higher, there's shipment delays. It makes sense to raise prices to cover the cost of doing business. But they're saying, no, we're doing that and more. In other words, we're widening our profit margins. And this is a great time to raise prices and nobody's stopping us, right? That's what we're talking about. They're raising prices simply because they can, or because we let them, because the lawmakers who are supposed to regulate corporate power are not doing their job, right? So the solutions are right there. Number one, invest more in building productive capacity, which is great because you hire millions of people, you upgrade the infrastructure, the technology, you democratize access to these things. And number two, you tax and regulate this undemocratic, abusive market power, monopoly power out of the system, which is antithetical to capitalism, to competition, to the principles of the market in the first place. That's why we have antitrust laws, is to make the market more competitive. So if we do that in healthcare, in transportation, in housing, in education and access to public education, we would be able to tame the sources of inflation that we had for a long time. And then for the logistics and supply chain disruptions that are related to the pandemic, again, we do this by either investing in producing things more locally here in the United States, or at least regionally within this part of the world and closer to home, or investing in actually unclogging the global supply chains, investing in actually preventing pandemics that will cause more disruptions in the future, right? In terms of the conflict in the Ukraine, the solution is not raising the interest rate. That's not going to stop the war. Stopping wars typically works through diplomacy, through negotiating peace treaties. That's how these things typically end, peacefully. And we're certainly not, making any progress on that front. If anything, not an expert on these things, but it looks like things are escalating, not getting resolved. So that's kind of where we are. And it looks like the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which Congress passed, at least moves us in the right direction, because it does increase spending on key strategic areas for renewable energy. It does empower Congress to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies, which is where a lot of the abusive market power is, to negotiate prices of 20 major drugs. It does provide tax credits or subsidies to consumers to buy more made in America electric vehicles. Of course, this is not affordable for everybody, but we're moving in the right direction in terms of addressing these key inflation pressure points, but we're nowhere near what needs to be done to really undo these inflation pressure points and undo the abusive market power of major corporate players in the US and beyond.
Thank you so much. I think that people are wondering, how long is this gonna last? How long are prices gonna keep going up? Are they ever gonna come back down? Is that how inflation works? Is it almost like, we enter a recessionary period and then at a certain time we start coming up? Or what does that look like from your perspective?
Well, I'm trying to be as realistic as possible about where we are and what I think governments around the world are doing. If we look at the conversation we just had about inflation pressure points, what should be done versus what governments are primarily doing, unfortunately, I don't see inflation disappearing anytime soon. The conflict in the Ukraine is not disappearing. The abusive market power of real estate companies, of pharmaceuticals, of Wall Street, all of this is here to stay, unless we see significant action from Congress to actually upgrade and enforce antitrust regulations and truly go after corporate power in the US and beyond. If I see significant movement in that front, then I can tell you, yes, inflation pressure points will start to ease. If I see significant, like massive investment in alternative sources of energy, so we don't have to rely on global oil and natural gas prices, then I can tell you, yeah, we have domestic sources of energy. We're taming that source of inflation globally, because these prices are determined globally. If I see lots of other countries in the global south start to invest in their own food sovereignty and rely less on Russian food imports, Ukrainian food imports, and build more resilient food systems anyway, then their food prices will be insulated from all of these conflicts. The same with us. But as long as we have these global pressures, food prices will continue to rise, because fertilizer prices are continuing to rise because of energy prices. And because of higher energy prices, the shipping of everything is costing more, which means prices will be transferred onto consumers. So I'm realistic about where we are and what is being done. And it looks like we're not doing enough to undo these inflation pressure points, unfortunately. And at the same time, we're hearing major central banks, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, who are doubling down on this idea of raising the interest rate to fight inflation. And the more they do, the closer we are to crashing the economy into a recession. So the sad reality is that eventually, if this continues, we will crash the economy. And when people lose their jobs, they will not have the income to afford transportation, to afford a new dishwasher, to afford a new house or a new car. And that will reduce demand, and that will lead to lower inflation. So we have two options: doing this the painful way, which is what central banks are going to do, or doing this the more resilient, the healthier, the more, without throwing people under the bus, which is addressing the actual pressure points. And that becomes a question of democracy. Do we have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, like it's supposed to be, and go after corporate power and tame the sources of inflation and democratize access to housing and health and transportation and food? Or do we not? And that is fundamentally what this question about taming inflation is. Will the government that we have, the 535 people we send to Washington, D.C., will they go after the abusive market power, which is their responsibility? That's what they're elected for. And if they're not, because they worry about the position of their party, campaign contributions, then we know it's not a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's a government for the super PACs and the corporations and the abusive market power. And we have to call them out on it. This is what democracy is supposed to be.
Beautifully said. And I would like to ask, because I know there is confusion both with this current president and the president before it, thanking President Trump for low gas prices and then blaming Biden for high gas prices. Just could you clarify a little bit, like what role the president has in inflation?
Very little role when it comes to gas prices in particular, especially when we're talking in the short run. These things can be transformed with policies from Congress and the president, in other words. over the long term. But in the short term, we're talking about a couple of years, a few months. There isn't really much that a president can do or not do to affect gas prices. And a lot of people say, well, if you just let these oil companies just drill more, we'll have plenty of oil and plenty of gas here in the US and it'll be cheaper. Well, guess what? Mexico imports 50% of its gasoline from the US. Right, so we're a major exporter of gas. We're not producing gas just for the US. We're plugged into a global economy, right, in terms of the raw material, the crude oil that we bring into the country for our refineries, and what we export to the rest of the world. Because oil is not just for gas, it's for all kinds of petrochemicals that go into industrial processes and plastics all over the world. So it's much more complicated than what a president can do. A lot of people say, well, what if we remove the gasoline tax? Well, at the state level, then states will go bankrupt because they rely on those taxes to fund their operations and to fund the construction and renovation of maintenance of roads and things like that. But at the federal level, the federal government doesn't need really the 18 cents a gallon that we pay in federal taxes. So if you remove that, it's going to lower your gas price by 18 cents a gallon. When gas prices were at $5 a gallon earlier last summer, that wouldn't have made much a difference. But if we think long term, most people don't necessarily need gasoline. Most people need to go from point A to point B at a low cost and a very convenient and safe means of transportation. Right now, it's cars, but it doesn't have to be that way, especially in major metro areas. If we invest in upgrading and building public transportation that is so accessible, so convenient, so safe, so clean, and so affordable, we would have solved a huge component of the energy costs and the inflation cost. And this is true for us here in the US and other parts of the world. So are we having a serious conversation about how we invest in public transportation in this country? Unfortunately not, right? And that is what Congress should be doing as a long-term, and this will create millions of good paying jobs in the US for manufacturing and construction and maintenance, and would provide a much higher quality of life for the majority of working class, middle class Americans, for youth who would benefit from having public transportation to go to sports activities and arts and music and schools and things that currently parents will have to either shuttle their kids back and forth all day, or just not let them engage in music and culture and theater and all of these wonderful things that will build the future generation. So the ripple effect of doing these things is just unimaginably positive for everyone in the country. But we're not having these conversations. We're focused on, can this president lower my gas price so I can drive to work, so I can drive to the grocery store? We're not thinking of transforming the system. We're thinking about keeping the system as is, which means we're keeping the abusive market power of oil and gas companies. That's not going to go away.
Very well said. And that is exactly the work that we're doing here at the think tank, identifying those pressure points and the root causes of issues like this, and identifying our initial thought process and rethinking how we can address those root causes, like you were saying, because we do need to come together to make it work for us all. And how are we going to do that in a way that, impacts our communities in the best way for the long term? So we have to get to that point where we're thinking how our actions impact our futures, rather than just thinking about getting to work the next day. And it's hard when, we're getting by just thinking about how we're going to get there. What are we going to do? But this work is so important. And thank you so much for your time and for your education today. Thank you all for listening to this and learning with us. It is an honor and a pleasure, and we can't wait to see you next time.
Thank you, Al. My pleasure.